So due to having a family that don't celebrate Christmas, due to religious reasons, I often spend Christmas with my girlfriend and her family. In my girlfriend's room at the top of her wardrobe is a music box which was a gift from her mother from a Christmas years ago, I believe. It's just a little wind-up music box that you twist and it plays We Wish You a Merry Christmas. Anyway, we'd all done the standard opening of the presents, pulled some crackers, said Merry Christmas, etc. Then me and the girlfriend and her mum went upstairs to put the presents somewhere out of the way. My girlfriend's mum was talking about how her own mother, who died a few years ago, and how she loved Christmas and wished she could still be there with them all. Straight after that, this music box starts going off on top of the wardrobe, way too high for anyone to have reached and turned, and nobody had even been near that part of the room. Also, interestingly, my girlfriend's room was previously her grandmother's room, and my girlfriend only moved into the room after the death of her grandmother. My girlfriend's mother believes it to be a message from her own mother, letting them all know she's still with them. We're all not sure, but it was interesting timing nonetheless, and I've no idea how it would have been set off otherwise. I had a friend I made in Indonesia while I worked in Jakarta. I was chatting to her one night via Yahoo Messenger with the video on. This was back in 2010, a few months before I met my wife. I've been chatting to her for some time, and at some point, I noticed a girl behind her sitting on the floor. She was just chilling out, smiling with legs bent in front of her. I was really amused because my friend had been chatting to me for some time, and it turns out she's been ignoring her friend the whole time. So I teased and said, "Hey, a head just popped up behind you," expecting her to say, "Oh, that's my friend, such and such. She's just hanging out." Instead, she said, "What head? I'm alone." And I say, "There's a girl with glasses behind her, and she looks totally freaked out." I joked that she had a ghost. I didn't mean it. It just looked like an ordinary young woman. And it kind of looks like the woman ducks down and is gone. I asked my friend to get up so I can see her room and it's empty. She says she's totally alone. My friend looks really frightened and I try to calm her down and say I might have been imagining things, but I only say it to calm her down because she looks so scared. It was late, but at that time I regularly went to bed late and I felt pretty awake because text chatting always makes me a bit nervous for some reason. Then, she says that 3 of her other friends told her they can see a girl in her house, but she's never seen the girl herself. They all described her as wearing glasses, except everyone else she is wearing different clothes. 1, actually 2, says it's a red dress. Another, a dark blue shirt, and for me, she was wearing a white sort of blouse, shirt and pants. Her glasses are big and square, and she looks to be in her late teens or early 20s. Indonesians can be hard to age. Anyway, she tells me she basically didn't take her other friends seriously. Indonesians can be a bit superstitious. For example, I had an Indonesian colleague who was training to be some sort of shaman. And my friend was not into any of that stuff. Did not believe in ghosts or have any real religious beliefs. I didn't believe in ghosts either, and if she hadn't looked so freaked out and told me about her friends, I might have put it down to a hallucination. The other thing was that the video window was quite small, but the picture was clear, and it wasn't glitchy or blocky. It would be weird if my imagination overloaded a hallucination so perfectly to appear partly obscured by my friend's desk on the floor behind her. The funny part of the story is that we both thought the other person was lying. I thought she was lying there, being no one in the room, and she thought I was lying and didn't believe I saw someone. Nevertheless, the fact I saw this girl independently of her other friends, each of the other 3 also saw the girl independently of each other, intrigued my friend, and so she asked me questions about her. Although I only saw her briefly, I still remember exactly what she looked like. The next time I chatted to my friend on a different day, we talked about it again. Apparently, she asked more questions of her other friends. She had a friend that claimed to be a psychic that supposedly communicated with the ghost, and the ghost said she liked it in the house, and that she was kidnapped, murdered there, back when the area used to be farmland. My friend lived outside of Jakarta in a place called Depok. I don't know if I believe any of this bit. I only know what I saw, and what I saw just appeared to be an ordinary young woman. Totally solid, not transparent or anything like that. I went back to Jakarta as part of a Southeast Asian holiday with my wife and met up with my friend. I asked her again if she was playing a joke on me, and she still claims she wasn't, and we chatted about it again. If she's playing a prank on me, one, she's an amazing actor. She really looked scared when I said there was a girl in her room. Two, she improvised a story about her friends also seeing a girl really quickly. And three, it really wasn't her style of humour. It's made me more open to the idea of ghosts, but being scientifically trained, I still have in my mind that it might have been a joke or a trick of the mind. I kept the transcript of the text chat, though, and it still strikes me as very genuine on my friend's behalf. It's a shame I couldn't save the video, and even if I could at the time, I didn't think I was seeing anything unusual, apart from the fact I thought my friend was being really rude and ignoring a guest. I'd post the transcript, but there are bits of it I found cringy because we had a running joke where we sort of jokingly flirted with each other, but it only makes sense in the context of our friendship, and it's a bit embarrassing. This church has been in the same location for nearly 200 years. Although the buildings have been updated, you can't go in the church outside of normal operating hours or in small groups without having an experience. I have several stories that I would like to share, but I'll start with the first thing that happened to us. This took place when we were around 12 to 13 years old. My friend, David, the custodian's son, and I were at the church helping to set up for an event that was to take place later in the evening. While we weren't completely alone, there were only a handful of people in the building, all of whom were on the ground floor. We were tasked with the mission of retrieving a roll of tape from the second floor, so we took a shortcut through the back of the church that has a very narrow staircase that leads directly into the sanctuary. Our destination is the secretary's office, which is right beside the sanctuary. As we're walking through the sanctuary, we both hear what sounds exactly like a very loud heartbeat, coming from no particular area. We run out of the sanctuary before even getting the tape and try to figure out where the sound may have come from, coming up with the conclusion that it was supernatural, considering there's no type of instrument in our church that could have made it. And it was too loud to be coming from the ground floor where everyone else is. Fast forward to a few weeks ago, and we're having a gathering at the church. The area where the previously mentioned staircase is has always been a popular place for the kids to play that is out of the way. So I'm in there with the kids because most of them are my cousins and I like to pick on them. They were all daring each other to go into the small storage area that's under the staircase. My youngest cousin, about 5, crawls out from under the stairs and says that he saw something under them. I ask him what it is, to which he replies, "I saw a beating heart." He's never heard me talk about hearing a heartbeat, so it gave me chills hearing it. I've also never considered him someone to have a wild imagination either. May have been a coincidence, but with all the experiences I've had in that church, I'm tempted to believe him. So, my church is haunted, but there are areas that one might consider a hotspot. These areas are the first floor men's bathroom, the bridal room, which is beside the staircase mentioned in my first story, and the baptismal, which is connected to the third floor bathrooms. After years of being the custodian's son / part-time custodian, my friend has experienced pretty much all the notable spirits and ghosts that are in the church. One of these spirits is little more than a mild inconvenience due to the fact that it likes to throw a wet paper towel in an otherwise clean hallway. My friend had told me about this spirit's antics before the story I'm about to tell occurred. My friend and I were around 16 when this happened. My friend was playing basketball with 2 other friends from church one day during summer break. This was midday, so there was no one else at the church, and the church remained locked until we decided to go in. Being the custodian's son, my friend had a key. While taking a break from playing, all three of my friends swore that they saw the blinds in one of the windows on the 3rd floor move like someone had brushed their hand from top to bottom. Me, not being a big basketball person and was not at the church to witness this part, immediately after they saw the blinds move, they called me to tell me that they were going to go inside to investigate if I was interested in joining. I arrived a few minutes later and we went in. Obviously, being an old building, the church has a tendency to make noises, but some of these are very distinguishable footsteps. One of my buddies put his phone on the voice recorder and sits in the first pew of the sanctuary while we're wandering about the rest of the building, hoping to record some of the noises we kept hearing. We place the phone down and head to the 3rd floor. Nothing paranormal occurs on our first pass, but for some reason, we decide to take the same exact path that we had just taken over and over. On our second go-round is when we notice something strange. There's a broom propped up in the doorway of the men's bathroom on the 3rd floor. This broom was without a doubt not there on the first pass. We don't think much of this until our 3rd trek, when we notice that the broom is still in the doorway, but in a different position. The thing about it was that the broom had not slid out at the bottom, but had been stood up. We continue on this path maybe 3 or 4 more times. Each time the broom has been moved to a different position in the same doorway. We decided that it had been long enough, so we went to check on the phone that my buddy had put in the sanctuary. We all go in and begin listening to the recording when we realise how stupid of an idea it was, because we couldn't tell what was us and what wasn't. That is, until we hear a loud tap that sounded like someone is coming from a few pews behind the phone. The tapping gets closer. Then one more tap even closer. Finally, there was what sounded exactly like a triple tap on the screen of the phone. After listening to the recording, we decided to check on the broom one more time. As we reach the 3rd floor, there are 2 very obvious things that have changed. 1, the broom is now in a different doorway. And 2, there is a wet paper towel laying in the middle of the hallway in front of the men's restroom. My friend claims to have seen a reflection that wasn't ours in the window across the hall from us, and that's when we decided that we were done ghost hunting for the day. A couple of years later, one of my buddies is helping his dad, who's a plumber, renovate one of the bathrooms in the church. As they headed to the bathroom, my buddy spots a familiar sight. In the middle of the hallway, lays a wet paper towel. The first story is about the parsonage that is beside the church. For those of you who may not know, a parsonage is a house close to the church that the pastor lives in. Anyway, at the time that this happened, we had a temporary pastor who had been living in the parsonage for a little over a year. The pastor had a son who was my age and told me and my friend this story. While living in the parsonage, he always had a bad feeling just from being in there. His bedroom was in the basement where this story occurs. One day, our pastors went into the basement to retrieve something from one of the storage areas. When he opened the door to the storage room, he was chased from the basement by a single crow. How the crow, if that is what it really was, got into the basement and then into a closed room is still a mystery to me. The second takes place in the ground floor bathroom. In this bathroom is a storage closet that has an unfinished floor that's just dirt. Pretty common in basements. This area is occasionally called the portal to hell by some of the kids my age, due to the uneasy feeling you get from being around it. As I was washing my hands, the door to the closet was pulled open, fast enough to make wind. Luckily, I was only washing my hands because I was out of that bathroom in a second flat. The third story takes place in the second floor bathroom. This bathroom is built up against a storage and maintenance room. During a gathering at the church, I went to an unoccupied area of the church to do my business, because I'm a gentleman. Anyway, as I was sitting there, I heard a loud scratching sound coming from the cinder block wall right behind my head. Trying to stay calm, I told myself something had tipped over in the maintenance room, and that's what made the noise. I finished up and decided to look into the closet. The door, which was normally locked, opened right up to reveal that there was nothing in the room that had tipped. nor was there anything that could have even produced that noise in the first place. My friend David and I were at his graduation party, and we were telling one of his other friends about some of the strange things that go on at our church. David's friend didn't really believe the stories, so we decided to take him to the church that night when we knew no one else would be there. We get to the church around 9 p.m, unlock the doors and go in. All the lights are off, so we're going room to room, turning them on as we go. Almost immediately, we all hear footsteps on the floor above us. We finish going through the first floor, and as we're ascending the stairs, we hear footsteps come to the top of the stairs, which is around a landing halfway up the staircase. In the window on the landing, we can clearly see an outline of what looks like a person. At this point, our friend had decided that he had gotten enough proof to believe our stories and was ready to leave. We were standing in the parking lot facing the door, arguing over who was going to have to go back inside and turn all the lights off when, all of a sudden, there are 3 very distinct taps on the nursery window. The nursery's on the 2nd floor and on the side of the building we were facing. That made the decision about turning the lights out a bit harder. Fun fact about the nursery. Once we got back to David's house, we were telling his mom, the actual custodian for the church, about what had happened, and she told us that she hated to go into the nursery while she was alone, due to the feeling she got going in there. She also said that the old wooden rocking chair that was in there would almost always be rocking when she went in to clean, so she would go clean something else and wait for whoever was in the rocking chair to finish up. I wasn't raised in a religious family. I like to think of myself as an analytical person and try to rely on evidence for most of my beliefs. Growing up in Midwestern Michigan, there was a time in my adolescence that I'm sure many people experienced. A time when I was looking for some place to belong. While many teenagers drive their parents nuts by surrounding themselves with drinking and drugs, my rebellion was in the form of a church in my hometown. I had a pretty robust youth group, and they accepted me quickly. It was a safe place, a community that acted like a family I could confide in. I threw myself into it and spent a few years being embroiled in everything they did. So much so that my parents questioned whether I was involved in a cult. The prolonged encounter with the church was an important step along my personal development and would also become the catalyst for one of the most frightening moments of my life. This was during a mission trip that we took to Sarasota, Florida, in the summer of 1997. Sarasota is a small city with a population of a little more than 50,000 people. The city was very socio-economically divided, being populated by the very rich and the very poor. The mission trip was located at a modest Baptist church within the city. The purpose was to conduct a vacation Bible school, VBS, for the children that lived in the neighborhood, mostly economically disadvantaged youth. I knew nothing else about the church. We were given no information about the congregation or beliefs ahead of time. The only background provided was that our youth pastor, David, made contact with this small church and agreed to donate our time to help coordinate this VBS program. I was relatively close with several of the people on the trip. However, we were joined by a student who was not part of our youth group named Alvin. I do not remember exactly why he came, as I was never close to him, but I remember being told that Al's mother wanted him to be a Christian, in contrast to that Asian American heritage, an idea at the time that he seemed to be disinterested in. A dry, straight-laced young man, he was almost an opposite personality of my friends and me, largely immature, outgoing goof-offs looking for attention. Nevertheless, he attended the trip with the rest of us. We all loaded onto the bus and headed south. We arrived in Sarasota, got to work, and the first part of the trip was pretty uneventful. Nothing seemed unusual. We worked, teaching certain classes ranging in topics that a normal, non-denominational Christian Sunday school would usually teach. It wasn't until the last couple of days of the trip that things started going off the rails. Close to dusk, the second to the last day of our trip, our group was outside playing kickball with the children while we waited for their parents to pick them up. It was a hot summer's day in Florida, so many of us Michigan kids were not used to the humid, hot evenings that followed. I decided to go into the church to get a drink and cool down, escaping the large number of gnats that constantly accosted me whenever I stepped outside. The church itself was made out of white plaster, a common style in Florida. The exterior was peeling, but the inside seemed to have been cared for meticulously. The dark green carpet was everywhere except for the chapel, which itself was burgundy with gold designs. The building of the church was shaped like a T. You entered the double doors at the bottom of the T. The long hallway had an extended mirror that was attached to one wall, and a sitting bench was on the other. There was wood bedboard-type panelling that went halfway up the wall to the mirror. As you continued down the hall at the T-junction, you could take a left and walk into the chapel, or you could go right and walk into a large dining room that was filled with tables. I walked through the doors at the bottom of the T, and as teenagers are wont to do, I glanced at the mirror to check my own reflection, check the outfit, the hair, the overall appearance. Adolescence is a vain time. Anyway, as I looked in the mirror, I saw Alvin sitting on the bench opposite the mirror, just looking at me. I quickly questioned what he was doing inside, away from everyone. "Hey Al, what you doing, man? Don't like kick..." And then, as I'm saying it, interrupting my sentence, he smiled in what felt like a disingenuous, menacing simper. He then raised his hand, forming a gun-shaped hand gesture, and winked while pointing at me, clicking his tongue to make a sound, acting in a way that seemed uncharacteristic for who I knew Alvin to be. I chuckled and turned away from the mirror to speak to him. As I did that, I realised there was no one there. I looked back at the mirror to confirm what I was alone in the hallway. I didn't understand. I didn't just see him out of the corner of my eye. I mean, at first I did, but I then looked right at him into his eyes, with the mirror simply as a conduit. I heard the sound of his tongue making what would soon be a familiar clicking sound. When the image of Al disappeared, the fright washed over me in what seemed to be similar to a panic attack. A tingling that transformed my warm body into a shaky, nervous husk of who I usually was. I ran outside and grabbed the first person I came in contact with, my friend Ronnie. Ronnie and I were not extremely close, but we had fun together because we were both outgoing, obnoxious, overconfident males that focused more on fun than on the purpose of our visit. When I approached him, I immediately saw in his eyes that he knew something was wrong. "Dude, I don't know what's happening. I just saw something super weird. I feel like I'm losing my mind." "What happened?" Ronnie asked, starting to smile with some humour at how freaked out I seemed. I walked inside and looked in the mirror to see Al just sitting there, smiling at me. But it wasn't Al. It looked like him, but when I started talking to him, he just stared at me and made this gesture. At this point, I showed him the finger-pointing, winking gesture. Something about the way I recreated the look seemed to take the smile from Ronnie's face. When I started talking to him and I turned to continue the conversation, Al wasn't there. As if we were thinking the exact same thing, we turned to look and find where Alvin was at the moment. Our eyes scanned the crowd in opposite directions, both arriving at the same point where Al sat, watching the kickball game. He wasn't partaking, as I remember him to be a sober, pensive kid, not the kickball type, and definitely not one who would have given me some weird pointing gesture while winking. Al is all the way over there, so what was it? A ghost? Like a demon or something? Ronnie asked, shocked. "Dude, how the crap should I know?" We spoke in a very strange surfer-like dialect for two mid-Michigan boys. I then saw this look of what seemed to be an understanding wash over Ronnie's face, like it all made sense to him. He said, "You know what? This is right. This is Satan. He's trying to distract you from doing God's work. He has no power here. Let's go tell him." I followed Ronnie into the church, like we were on some mission. It was empty again, but I felt this cold, uneasy feeling as soon as we stepped inside. As I stepped, it was the middle of summer in Florida, and we were inside an old church with a barely functioning AC unit, but I remember instantly being chilled. And Ronnie starts yelling, "Hey Satan, you ain't got nothing on us. Bring it, you can't stop us. What you got?" Did I mention we were overconfident? We waited in silence for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Nothing happened. We looked at each other, seeing what seemed to be a creeped out factor showing on each of our faces. We paused for a split second, then began laughing out loud at the ridiculousness of the situation. Maybe I just overreacted. Dramatic teenagers and whatnot. The evening ended after the last adult arrived to pick up their child. My youth group and I loaded the bus and headed back to the condo that we had rented. It was dark by this time, and I had calmed down a bit, momentarily forgetting what happened. The bus ride took some time, so I usually would just sit there looking out the window at the landscape that were unusual to me, a boy from the north. We drove along the coast, passing interesting architecture surrounded by unfamiliar foliage, common to the Florida ecosystem. As we rode, I looked out the window and saw a person sitting on a large stone sign for a different church, a Roman Catholic cathedral. I squinted to see him, as I was curious what the character was doing sitting on such a fancy-looking stone slab sign. As the bus got closer and closer, to my growing fright, I started to realise that the person sitting on the slab was someone I knew. That person was Alvin. He was sitting on the sign, looking down at his feet as he kicked them, resembling that of a much younger boy. As we passed him, Alvin sitting on the sign, he looked up from his feet and looked directly at me. His eyes were not Alvin's eyes. They were different. Another older, wiser man's eyes, piercing through the notion and distance. He looked at me and smirked with that menacing, threatening grin. As we began to pass, I turned my head to look to the front of the bus. Just a few seats ahead of me, Al sat, quietly doing what I had been doing a few moments before, looking at the water. I looked back out the window as we passed. The other Alvin raised his hand into the familiar gun-pointing gesture and pointed at me. What was even more strange, I could hear the clicking sound in my head, and I'm not sure how to explain this, but it wasn't coming from me. It wasn't my common inner monologue voice. It was something else. He winked. For the lack of a better phrase, I began to freak out. I shouted and drew attention from some of my friends, my assistant youth pastor Jason, and my pastor David. I remember thinking that I was losing my mind. The intensity of faux Alvin's eyes and the click of his tongue playing on repeat in my brain, and no one seemed to understand my panic. David said we would talk about once we got settled back at our condo, and I should just take a breath. We arrived at the condo. It was lavish accommodations to a small down kid, causing me to wonder how one would arrange payment for such a place, especially for a gaggle of teenagers. It had tall vaulted ceilings, and the decor was designed in the early 90s, so it was fitted with brass lighting fixtures and lightly stained oak finishings. Exiting the bus, my knees were shaky. A fog of embarrassment settled over me as other kids gazed with an obvious wonder that only children with a lack of decorum would show. My youth pastors took me into the back bedroom away from the kids, giving me a pint of Haagen-Dazs coffee ice cream that assisted in calming my nerves. Once settled, they proceeded to talk to me about what they thought was happening. David gave his version of what he believed was transpiring. There's a war happening. A war between heaven and hell, where angels and demons are in a battle for the souls and sanity of God's followers, David shared. And what you and Ronnie did was incredibly stupid. You challenged Satan to a battle that you cannot win. He's too powerful. That was his foothold. You need to be more careful. This did very little to calm my nerves. It seemed uncharacteristically morose of David to be that blunt, especially with a teenager. He continued, "Do not do that again. If you keep doing the right thing, God will protect you. But you cannot tell anyone else that this happened. It spreads fear that Satan thrives on. Being a native young Christian at the time, I believed him. I thought that this war could seem possible, but I also trusted a mentor that I shouldn't share my story. And I would follow that advice for years. I went to bed early that night, trying to move past this experience. Alvin's face and the clicking gesture continuing to haunt my thoughts. It didn't work. The next day was our last day at the church. We were done coordinating the VBS program, but the leaders of the church wanted to treat us to a dinner as a way of saying thanks. I didn't think about it at the time, but it was very strange that we hadn't met the pastor or the church until this dinner. Beforehand, we had picked up all of our belongings and were prepared to leave once we finished dinner. We all sat on the east side of the church, in the dining area with all the tables, eating the spaghetti dinner that they had provided us. It was a happy scene. I looked around at everyone enjoying the meal, laughing and joking around the tables. Suddenly, the back door of the church opened, and a cold gust of wind rushed past me. Bizarre for a Florida summer afternoon, followed by the entrance of a tall, elderly man and two slightly younger women behind him. As with all members of the youth group, I had never met this man before. He was introduced to us as the pastor, but none of us recall ever hearing his name or last name. All I could focus on was his eyes. They seemed familiar to me, although I couldn't place them. They weren't kind eyes, although I couldn't articulate that in my mind at the time. He spoke a short sentence or two of thanks to the group, and then proceeded to move past the tables, sharing short statements of small talk, referring to my friends as guy, ladies, or, in the case of Ronnie, young man. As he slowly approached me, I continued to eat spaghetti because free food. The pastor moved deliberately behind me until I could feel his bony hand touch my right shoulder. I turned around to look and saw the pastor glaring straight into my eyes. Not a polite stranger's glance, but a deep, disturbing stare. Those eyes. I'd seen them before. He took his hand off my shoulder and spoke. "Hey, how's it going?" Something was wrong, and it was immediately obvious to me. No one had met this pastor. He didn't know any of us from Adam, and he referred to everyone as such, with generic titles like son and darling. But he knew my name. He looked at me like he knew me, and then he did it. He smiled in that familiar, menacing way, lifted his hand and made the pointing gesture while winking. He closed it out with the tongue-clicking sound. I shot up, backed up quickly, clambering for my footing as I knocked over some empty chairs and ran out of the dining hall. I ran to the adjacent chapel and did the only thing that came to my mind at that moment. Sat in a pew and cried. My pastor and my pastor's wife, Kathy, followed me shortly after. I expected to hear their voice of reassurance, the kind people that had been mentors to me for years. This is not what followed. "What are you doing, P?" "That was the rudest thing I've ever seen. What's wrong with you?" David shouted. "You're acting like a baby," Kathy exclaimed. This was extremely uncharacteristic of both of them, so I knew something was wrong. They were usually very calm, kind people in public. So I ran from them. I ran out of the chapel, down the long hallway, past the mirror where I had originally seen who I thought was Alvin, and out of the front doors. Followed directly after me, Kathy stepped out of the door before the door even closed. I turned to see her express transform, from angry hunter to concerned caregiver. "What's wrong, honey? Why are you crying?" I knew immediately why the anger left her. She had left the church. She was outside. Something was wrong with that place. After discussing what I felt had happened, I never went to that church again. I waited outside for the rest of my group to finish eating. Afterwards, David, with a small group of us, did some weird type of ritual where he anointed the church and its door with oil. He read some scriptures that were unfamiliar to me, and we boarded the bus and left. I haven't spoken with David or Kathy in decades, but directly after this happened, Kathy, while coming short of saying I was lying, disagrees with the sequence of events. She seems to believe that she heard me making a ruckus outside, so she followed me directly out there, concerned for my well-being. David remembers being angry at me, and while he seemed more docile out of the building, he seemed to treat me differently afterwards. The church itself seems to have been disbanded. I cannot find any mention of the church on the internet, and members of the youth group that I have kept in touch with have gone to Sarasota and not been able to find the location. Even though we took the same route several times a day, one particular friend said there's just a field where the building used to be, as if this experience had never happened. Because David had told me that I shouldn't talk about what had happened, I didn't discuss this experience with any of my church friends, at least not for a long while. A few years later, I spoke about these events with friends. I made out so at the church. My story is often met with the mixture of interest and skepticism that I often would experience this phenomenon. I've since left the church and personally have arrived at a certain level of agnosticism. I like to think that I do not believe in ghosts or demons, but I also cannot deny that which happened to me in the summer of '97. I don't have an explanation, and there are too many things that do not make sense. I hope that I just had a mental break of some sort, because the alternative is much more frightening. I live in a house with my mom, sister, stepdad, stepsister, 2 dogs and my cat. My stepdad is a major paranormal skeptic. My sister is a little over-believing, and my mom and stepsister are mostly neutral. A lot of my family has experienced some really scary things. My grandpa has moved because of it, and it's sort of common knowledge that we can all tell if something is paranormal or not. My grandpa has had weird, terrifying things happen that he'll insist aren't paranormal at all, and some things that are slightly less scary that he'll insist were. I can generally tell if someone else is telling the truth about some experience, but for myself, I just can't tell the way they can. And I think it's partially because of my anxiety, which is constantly making my thoughts contradict themselves. Anyway, I have several seemingly disconnected incidents that I guess I can just bullet point out. They're over my entire span of living here, so I can't really remember the order. I'm standing in my sister's doorway. I was leaning on the doorframe, reading over a thing she wrote for school she wanted me to look over, and the dog ran past me, kind of shoving me a little. I said, "That's rude, Mr. Sanders." The dog's name is Barry Sanders. We don't watch football. Don't ask me. A couple seconds later, I hear my sister crying and look up. The dog was asleep in her lap the entire time, so whatever ran past me was not our dog. We can't talk about it out loud because it still makes us choke up just how scared we were in that moment. I was laying in bed. It was pretty dark, but I wasn't asleep yet. I was just sitting on my phone waiting to get tired. I heard a really loud bang come from my closet, and my cat ran over and laid directly on my neck, which she does when either one of us gets scared. I already had Snapchat open, so I decided to start recording to see if it happened again, because I was pretty sure there were animals living in the walls, but my parents insisted they weren't that big of a deal. So I was hoping something else would happen, so I could have a bit of proof that I had reason to be bothered. You can't see anything in the video though, there's only sound. At the time, that didn't faze me because all I needed was proof the animal made sounds. Instead of another noise down the closet walls, there was a click, which you can barely make out in the video. But from my bed, I could see that it was the door handle turning. After that, the closet door swung back and forth, creaking extremely loudly when it normally hardly does at all. For the 11 seconds, if I remember correctly, that I kept recording. I stopped it because I wanted to turn the light on and immediately went to show the video to my mom. It happened another time after that, at night again, but I didn't record. I didn't feel threatened, but I did start keeping my laundry basket in front of the closet door and haven't had it since then. This one is possibly the scariest experience because no one has been able to explain it in a way that matches up with the story. Me and my sisters were in the kitchen. Both parents were taking a nap and had been for about an hour. We were the only ones in the kitchen for at least the previous hour. On the counter, there were some dirty dishes, and out of nowhere, my mum's measuring cup just exploded into tiny pieces all over the kitchen. We couldn't even walk anywhere and had to yell for our parents to put on shoes and sweep the floor around us so we could go and shake the glass out of our hair and clothes. I've looked it up and found some things about Pyrex measuring cups exploding, and not to the extent ours is, and ours was not a Pyrex. It was a really old one with all the measuring letters engraved so they wouldn't wash off. My grandma had given it to my mum about 3 or 4 years earlier. I was looking at different measuring cups for the sake of this post, and it was the same general look as a bread bunny, but I don't believe ours was. Once, I was on the phone with a friend and 2 things on my wall, one hung canvas and one hung glass frame, both fell at the exact same time. That's probably the one that can be explained the most easily, I guess, and it's also the shortest, but it's still weird. Similar to the dog incident, we, my stepsister and I, once opened the front door to get ready to go to school, and something large and black, a little bigger than our lab, looked like it ran through the house. However, we knew it wasn't the dog because he was already inside, and again, this was bigger than him. I don't think it was the same situation as the dog incident though, because it didn't push us at all, and didn't really have a specific shape. Whereas the previous one was so much like our dog that, had it been in another room when it happened, we wouldn't have ever thought about it again. But this was just sort of a black blob that appeared solid but wasn't. By the time we turned around, it was gone. There's some other smaller things, like canned goods falling over when they shouldn't be able to do that by themselves. The shower curtain being open, it was almost definitely closed before. Things going missing and showing up in odd places. My family also had quite a bit of paranormal and non-paranormal disturbing backstory if anyone might be interested in more context. Specifically, some things that happened when I was in my early teens, some things my grandpa said, who my stepdad brought the property from, and my family's very weird trademark of having near-death experiences and dying young, and how death follows us around in general. I really don't know if I'm looking to be proved wrong or told if I can't be. I guess it would just be nice to get some other opinions. I've also neglected to include the door video because, as I said, it's really only audio, and I believe that was the first paranormal aligned incident I actually paid attention to, and it was over 2 years ago now. If anyone really thinks it'll help, I can try to find it, but I honestly don't think it'll provide much since there's just the sound of a door creaking, and that could be faked pretty easily. Like I said, I'm a 21-year-old with no kids. It's important to know the story. So when I went with my dog for a walk this morning and was about to cross the street, when I noticed a girl about my age staring at me from the other street parallel to the one I was on. I first didn't think a lot about it and I kept going. Then I saw how she crossed the street to come to the one I was walking on while still staring at me. We crossed ways, and when he was closer, I could see her expression, and it was something like pity and nostalgia. It felt like she knew me from somewhere. Well, we crossed paths, but of course I didn't stop to stare at her back, so I kept going. Then I turned to look at her once more, and she was still standing on the same spot I walked past her 5 seconds ago, and she was looking straight in my face with the same expression of pity. I continued walking, and after a few seconds, I turned again, and she was still there staring at me with the exact same expression as the last time I turned back to look at her, before I continued my walk with the dog. I don't know why or how, but a thought came directly into my mind without any previous context. In my head, I was convinced that girl was my daughter from the future, and she was looking at me that way because I died and she was missing me. The whole day, I'm still really freaked out by this experience, and I thought about it. Look, my dad died when I was 7, and the night of his death, my mom dreamed he came into her dream and talked to her. He said he's okay and that she doesn't have to be worried about him. What if in my daughter's timeline I died And this moment was me in her dream, seeing her for like the last time. Like my father saw my mother for the last time in her dream. My father seemed to recognize my mother in the dream, and somehow I had that instant thought without previous context that that girl was my daughter. I recognized her instantly. I get shivers down my spine when I'm writing this. Like I said, I never had to do such things. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I've never believed in ghosts, but I have no explanation for this. Maybe I'm just crazy. So we moved into an old farm a few years ago, did lots of renovation work, found lots of strange things, boarded up rooms, bricked up the entrance to a cellar, loads of old abandoned items left there too, etc. The thing that's really bothering me is in our main kitchen, there's a small larder there. When we renovated, we wired some electrics and plumbing into there, and the room is used to store the fridge, foods, washing machine, etc. However, shortly after we started using that room, I began having a recurring nightmare. During the nightmare, I'm stuck in a wall cavity. I can hear moaning, screaming, crying and scratching sounds, etc. I scream for help, but nobody or nothing can hear me. I'll usually wake quite agitated and worked up from this nightmare. I've never had this nightmare before we moved into this house. After the first couple of times, I noticed a small pattern. I only had that dream when the door to the larder was left open. I dismissed it at first, but after a couple more occurrences, I started making sure it was shut before I went to bed. The nightmare stopped. Now, I've always been a bit skeptical and dismissed it as a subconscious thing, knowing it was shut was enough to stop the dreams. However, shortly after I had the nightmare again that night, I got up to check and the door was open. I closed it, bolted it and went back to bed. I asked my fiancé about it and he had got up in the night to get a drink and he left the door open. I told him about it and he was also a bit skeptical but thought it was odd. Regardless, he agreed to make sure it was shut in the future too, if it made me feel better. We've been really strict about this and the door has remained closed every night, since for just under a year. 2 days ago, my aunt had to borrow the washing machine. She lives on the farm with us but in a separate building, as hers had broken down. She forgot about her washing and popped in to get it, after I'd already gone to bed. She left the door open. I had the nightmare again. I can say with 100% certainty, I only have that dream when I'm in this house and that door is open, even when I'm not aware of it being open. I'm struggling to find a non-paranormal explanation for this. Is my kitchen, or rather the larder, haunted? When I lived in the apartments, at a young age, I would always have nightmares. This is normal for all kids, of course, for them to be so afraid that they have to cover their heads in bed, etc. Unless the mass population, lol, I would have these strange feelings and would be compelled to run outside as far as I could from the house. Obviously, they were maybe 10 years ago, so my memory of why I did this is still foggy. There was a time I ran to my friend's apartment building some blocks away, and I banged on the door and his dad answered, and I remember telling him someone was out to get me. Then he simply tells me to go home, so I do. As if the trance broke, I went home still slightly shaken, but I was perfectly fine and slept well. So this happens so frequently, I remember my dad locking my bedroom door from the outside, with rope, so I wouldn't run away again. There was a time he caught me sleepwalking around the house at 11 PM, but the rope didn't really help much. On a particular night, I had this insane feeling of fear and desire to get out of my room. I was so much in fear that I forcibly opened the door to my room, the rope snapped, and I ran outside. Everything after this went fuzzy, and I then remember it being around 6 or 7 AM, and I was a couple blocks away from my apartment home. I remember just walking around, and I was legit wondering why I was walking this far away, and how I stayed up the whole night. I walked back home and just in time to see my mom at the door. She thought I came out to help her with the groceries, so I never really told her the truth. Not long after that, the nightmare stopped. I ended up moving farther south of Jersey. But the sleepwalking and the sleep talking never stopped, till this day. This happened to me about 4 or 5 years ago, while I was living in a major metropolitan area of the Pacific Northwest. My wife and I lived in a condo on the second floor of this oldish 2-story building. While my wife was back home in Texas for the long weekend, weird shit started happening in our home. On the first night I was alone, I started hearing footsteps on the roof. Mind you, these sounded like stomps and not like little feet, just in case you thought it might have been a raccoon, possum, or any other night creature. They were loud, as if someone was running in circles just right above my bed. It really freaked me out, but I ignored it. The following night, my sister and mom stayed the night because they were visiting from just a few towns over. That night, I let my mom and sister sleep in the room, and I slept on the couch. My sister and my mom heard the stomps too. They didn't know what to make of it. So they woke me up to go check the roof. I went outside and looked, but there was nothing to be seen. They left the next day and we still didn't have a clue what the fuck was going on. It was getting really freaky by this point. So the night they left, I slept by myself in the condo again. I laid there without being able to sleep, and by 2 or 3 a.m, the stomping began. It would run all across the roof, and when it would get to the room, it would start stomping hard. So I'm really freaked out at this point, and I decided to load my handgun just in case it's some crazy homeless person or someone being crazy on the roof at 3 a.m. It kept running on the roof as I loaded the gun, when all of a sudden, the stomping stopped. And then, I heard a loud thump by the door, as if someone had jumped from the roof to the front of my door. It knocked on my door 3 times, loud as fuck. By this point, I'm paralysed in fear, but I said fuck it. Whatever it is, I'm going to get bullets straight to the head. I walked carefully towards the door, opened the door as fast as I could, but no one was there. I checked the roof, under the stairs, and there was no sign of anyone. The fear I felt ran cold through all of my body, because I still felt its presence, but I just couldn't see anyone. I went back inside, locked the door, and laid in bed with my gun next to me. I was terrified and couldn't sleep all night. The next night, my wife comes home. I told her everything that had been going on, and she just couldn't believe it. She asked me how come I only heard it when she was gone, and it had never happened in the past while she was there. I told her I didn't know why it happened that weekend when she wasn't around, but it happened. I had witnesses, my sister and mom, who had also heard the stomping. So I'm not going crazy, and this isn't just my imagination. I'm perfectly healthy, mentally and physically, so this couldn't have been some mental disorder. We went to bed together that night, and she told me not to worry, and that I probably had smoked a little too much cannabis during the weekend. I'm a bit pissed at her because she doesn't believe me and thinks I'm being superstitious. As we're falling asleep, something pulls on my toe. A hard pull on my toe, not some light touch. It was a violent pull on my big ass toe. I get up and wake up my wife and tell her. By this point she thinks I'm having some sort of hallucination. I should probably not smoke weed anymore, and I even started believing I was losing my mind. But as we're getting comfortable going back to sleep, the entity violently pulls her toe as well. She gets out of the bed in complete disbelief and trembling in fear. We turn the lights on, checked to see if someone was under the bed, but there was absolutely no one. We couldn't get back to sleep that night, and a few days later, the nail on my big ass toe turned a light shade of purple. What the fuck happened? I have no fucking idea. To this day, I have no fucking clue. I live in eastern Washington state, and all my life I've always wanted to experience something unnatural. This night, I had just finished playing Among Us with some friends on Discord, and I went out to my living room for, I guess, my kitchen. They're both connected, and I grabbed a glass of water. And I looked at the orchard, and we have a small chicken coop in that orchard, and underneath one of the apple trees to the right of the chicken coop for the small chicks, I saw a pile of sticks I've never seen before, and I thought that was weird. I looked at it jokingly. I was like, oh, it's like a gnome or something, since I'd already recently heard a story about them. And then I felt this feeling of being watched. So I went around the cupboard and I peeked at it. And I got this disgusting feeling. This dread I've never felt so small and weak before in my life. I never thought I'd feel something so wrong. I felt hunted. I felt like an animal. I started heading towards my room and I looked back and it felt so wrong. So wrong. I can't get over the feeling of horror that I felt while looking back at the window. I messaged a friend on Messenger about it, and then it started happening. A bump on my window, and he told me to record it. I recorded it, and it happened again. And I know there's no one there. There's no trees by my window. The closest tree is a pear tree that's about maybe 4 yards away from my window. I cut that bloody thing every year because cutting the grass around that fucking thing is miserable. I know that the pear tree didn't touch my window, but what assured me with the general feeling was there, and that it felt small. I tried to ignore it. I tried to watch something. I needed to fight the feeling of fear. I even tried to ask for help, but my parents' room is on the way by that window, and when I peeked it felt wrong. I ran back, and that's when I heard it. I heard this beating. This beating, it was like a heartbeat. I couldn't tell where it come from. I think I was on my roof. I got scared. No, and I hid under my covers. I hid under my covers like a little bitch. I hid. I was scared. I've never been so scared in my life. The closest thing to this feeling when I got assaulted by a bunch of dogs when I lived in Peru. And that's when I started hearing this moaning. This horrid moaning. And I asked my friend what to do. And he told me to record, and I did. I recorded it. And I sent it to him. And I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was man or animal. What it was. I sent him 2 videos, but then I felt the covers move by my leg. And I felt it grab me. It picked me up with one arm, or I don't know what its appendage or some fucking thing. It was a mess. If you could grab hold of me with that entire arm in my small room, and I saw his face illuminated by my aquarium light. It was vibrating. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it was. I can't describe its face. I just can't. My body shakes and goes numb when I think about it. I know it had a mouth. It laid me on the ground off on the side of the bed, and it put its big arm over my chest and put its mouth next to my face. And it said in perfect English, it said in the most perfect English I could ever have heard. It was like if a dog decided to speak. It sounded wrong, but it was so fucking perfect, and it told me, don't peek. And as abruptly as it came, it left. I don't know how it got in my room. I feel so unsafe. Oh my God. How did it get in my room? How? I don't know. All my life I wanted to feel high, wanted to see something unnatural, something supernatural. I've never been religious. But I said this night fucked me. I don't know what it was. And its face, and it left me intact, and no, it wasn't sleep paralysis. It moved me. It moved me from one place to another, and I sat there shaking, and I fucking pissed myself. I don't know what to do. I've never been so afraid in my life. My friend told me to ask on forums for what this was. If anyone knows what this thing was, what this thing is, please tell me. And if you're into cryptid or monsters, ghosts or anything of that, or aliens, it's not worth it. It is not worth it. It's not fucking worth it. So this happened to my family a few years back, but I believe it's a rather interesting, unexplained phenomenon, and I just discovered this sub. A little background before I get started. Me, my mum and uncle all reside in Texas. Grandmother, uncle too, and cousins too reside in New Mexico, where my grandmother has a shop. Cousin 1 is off at college in Colorado. Uncle 1 decided to go visit Cousin 1 at school, but on his way, stops in New Mexico to see the family for a few days. While visiting, a strange woman stops in the shop and asks for directions. She and Uncle 1 get to chatting, and I'm not sure of the specifics that led to this conversation, but she proceeds to tell him about a dream that she had recently. She says that in her dream, she was driving through the mountains and suddenly came to a halt. She realises that there was a mountain lion lying dead in the middle of the road. She gets out to see if there's anything she can do, but when she approaches the mountain lion, it takes life again and runs away into the mountains. The conversation comes to an end, and the woman takes her directions and goes about her way. Uncle One brushes the whole thing off as odd, but doesn't really give it much more thought. Days later, Uncle One convinces Uncle Two to accompany him to Colorado to visit Cousin One. It's important to note here that Uncle Two has emphysema. Where they were visiting was at a higher altitude, and Uncle Two ended up getting severe altitude sickness. It became so bad, they ended up in the hospital in an induced coma. Me, my mom, aunts, grandma, and cousin Two all travelled to Colorado to be there with him. Days turn into weeks, turn into months, and he's not getting better, let alone coming out of his coma. One day, we're all tired and stressed as things are looking grim. We're trying to decide where to eat when one of cousin Two asks for Applebee's. No one else wants to eat there. We try to talk her into something local, not a chain. She's insistent, and since Uncle Two is her father, the family takes pity and caves. This is where things get weird. As we're sitting at our table, that same odd woman from a whole other state from months before appears standing beside our table. She looks Uncle One dead in the eye and says, "It's time to go." And in a blink of the eye, she's gone with nowhere to be found. Months later, the hospital calls and says it's time to take Uncle Two off of life support. We abandon our meals, head to hospital, and they do just that. Uncle One never sees the strange woman again. This happened nearly 10 years ago, but I, 32F, can't shake the experience. So I've had deja vu 1,000 times, like many people, but it always seems to be gone in the blink of an eye. However, when I was in my early 20s, I had an entirely different experience. I was hanging out with a couple of friends, Dane and Corey, at Dane's house. Now, I've had multiple strange experiences there, mostly paranormal. Dane has lost 2 fathers, and he believes, as I do, that his biological father has stuck around, but that's neither here nor there. So me, Dane and Corey are all hanging out in this shed in the backyard where we normally do. We were just sitting there chatting when all of a sudden I got struck by a serious case of deja vu. Instead of it ending in an instant, it seemed like it was never going to stop. My heart started racing and the guys could see that there was something wrong. I told them what was happening, and the only way I could describe it was that it felt like a film strip stuck on repeat in my head, like when a CD skips. I started to panic as the minutes passed. I felt disoriented, but I knew I needed to get out of that shed. It had been about 5 minutes since it started, which may not seem very long, but it felt like a lifetime. I tried to gain my bearings and stood up, but I quickly tumbled back into my chair. I tried again and stumbled out of the shed. Dane's backyard has a big, beautiful oak tree right outside the shed. As I stepped outside and my feet hit the earth's surface, I felt a calm come over me. A breeze came out of nowhere and the branches of the tree started moving rhythmically. It's hard to explain, but I felt planted, just like the tree, like I couldn't move. I felt an odd connection with the universe, like some force was trying to connect with me. As if an invisible laser beam came from the sky straight to my mind. This frightened me even more. The guys came out to check on me and I snapped out of it and broke down in tears. We decided to go back in the house and I told them what happened. Corey was freaked out and left. I kept telling Dane about the film strip. I felt scared and out of it, not like myself. I really thought I was going to have to check myself into a mental institute, so I decided to go home. Once I got home, I calmed down, but I still felt uneasy for the rest of the night and was too scared to sleep. I had this giant book of different phenomenons and unexplained mysteries of the world that I've glanced through a few times. I looked up deja vu and sure enough, right there on the page, my exact words were printed. It said that sometimes deja vu can be long and frightening and can be described as a film strip stuck on repeat.